The establishment of Troon as a mining community is relatively recent. That happened in the mid-1800s with the discovery below ground in the Troon area of great riches in the form of tin and copper, and eventually the establishment of the great Wheelgrenville mine, which had riches beyond compare. However, if we're going to tell the story of human occupation of the Troon area, we need to go much farther back than that. There is some evidence found in gardens in Troon of small worked pieces of flint, which suggests that people, if they didn't live there, they certainly travelled through there in the New Stone Age. And then further up the hill from here, there is evidence of a village from the early Iron Age. But this huge granite stone that you see in front of us is very firm and tangible evidence of human occupation in this area, because this is the capstone, the covering stone of a great megalithic chamber tomb, which has sadly now fallen down. Other parts of it are scattered around here, and there are plans to re-erect it in the next few years, which would be wonderful if that could happen. But here, 2,000–3,000 years before the birth of Christ, people lived, they grew crops, and they died, and their people's bodies were brought here and interred under this massive capstone. The whole thing is situated within the confines of the old Pendarves estate. The Pendarves family, of course, were the dominant family locally. They were the people who owned much of the land at Troon, and they were the people to whom people paid for leases for houses when they built them in Troon. They lived in a large house, or manor house if you like, just across the fields here. It's not the house you can see there now. That's a modern building to house the manager of the farm, the fields of which you can see in front of you. But there, on the footprint of that, this house has been built, but the old manor house was previously there, and it was a grand house indeed. It was pulled down in 1953 for no good reason. That was a period when many country houses were being destroyed, and the estate really was split up at that point, and it's now effectively a farm. The Pendarves family's estate was essentially somewhere where they could enjoy their leisure time, and in front of you you can now see the ruins of their boathouse and the neglected remains of the big pond or small lake on which they would enjoy themselves in that boat. The estate itself was quite significant. It was surrounded by a stone wall, and there were lodge entrances at 3 points to that, and this is one of those lodges. Clearly it's not occupied by anyone connected with the estate now. It's a private home, but it would have been occupied by someone employed by the Pendarveses, and it would have been their job to come out and open the gate when they wanted to go in and out, to travel from the house out into other parts of the countryside, or indeed to come back home. And woe betide them if they weren't out and doing their job at the minute the carriage arrived. This beautiful and tranquil setting may seem a whole world away from a mining community like Troon, but it's very much a part of it, because this is the parish church of Troon. It's the parish church of Treslothan, which was created out of the larger parish of Camborne in the mid-1900s to deal with the rapidly rising population. That population, of course, in this area would have been drawn by the discovery of tin and copper in the great Wheelgrenville mine. You may wonder why the parish church is here in this setting, over a mile from the village. Well, that's because that society, when Wheelgrenville was first founded, was a society that was founded on class, and the miners would have been at the very bottom of that class society, and the people who had this church built, the local aristocrats, the Pendarveses, would have been at the very top. At some later stage there was a mission church built in the village itself so that Anglicans could worship there, but there's no doubt whatsoever that the vast majority of the miners and their families would have become Methodists for whatever reason. Maybe they valued the freedom and the independence that the Methodist faith gave them, the opportunity it gave them to participate in the services themselves. but the Anglican Church and the Methodist Church coexisted side by side in the village for many, many years. And this is an interesting building, and it's worth a look if we're talking about memories of Troon, to go in and see some evidence in the churchyard of certainly the Pendarveses and their position in society, but also perhaps some of the less important people who were buried here. So we'll just go inside now and have a look. Here in Treslothan churchyard is this building, which at first glance you may think is the church itself. It's not, however. This is a building that really typifies the gulf that there was between the landowning gentry and the ordinary men and women who lived in Troon, because this is the mausoleum of the Pendarves family, and it's coming on for being as big as a church in itself. Ordinary people, of course, had to be buried outside here in the churchyard, and very close to the mausoleum, just across here, is the grave of perhaps one of Troon's most famous sons. John Harris, who was buried here in this peaceful spot with his daughter Lucretia, knew mining communities well, and he knew mines even better. And although his poetry covers a whole range of subjects and environments, he wrote extensively about mines as well. Here's what he had to say. A mine spread out its vast machinery. Here engines with their huts and smoky stacks, cranks, wheels and rods, boilers and hissing steam pressed up the water from the depths below. Here fire whims ran till almost out of breath, and chains cried sharply, strained with fiery force. Here blacksmiths hammered by the sooty forge, and there a crusher crashed the copper ore. Here girls were cobbing under roofs of straw, and there were jiggers at the open hutch. Here a man-engine glided up and down, a blessing and a boon to mining men. And near the spot where many years before turned round and round the rude old water wheel, a huge fire stamps was working evermore, and slimy boys were swarming at the trunks. The noisy lander by the trapdoor bawled, with pincers in his hand and troops of maids, and heavy hammers break the mineral stones. The cartman cried and shook his broken whip, and on the steps of the account house stood the active agent with his eye on all. That was a description he wrote of the surface workings of a mine, but he also described underground. Below were caverns grim with greedy gloom, and levels drunk with darkness, chambers huge where fear sat silent, and the mineral sprite forever chanted his bewitching song. Shafts deep and dreadful, looking darkest things, and seeming almost running down to doom. Rock underfoot, rock standing on each side, rock cold and gloomy frowning overhead. Before, behind, at every angle, here blazed a vein of precious copper ore, where lean men laboured with a zeal for fame, with face and hands and vesture black as night. The casual visitor to Cornwall might be a bit puzzled to see these ruined buildings all around the landscape, but for anyone who knows what they're talking about, these iconic buildings will tell you instantly that you're in the mining heartland. And wherever you are in Cornwall where there's a mining community, you will find these buildings. They are buildings that house the great steam engines that pumped water out of the mines or wound the ore up from deep underground. And without them, of course, the mine could not exist, because the major problem they found was that of water. We're here on the site of the South Pendarves mine, which eventually became part of one of the greatest mines in Cornwall, the Great Wheel Grenville mine. And it was the Great Wheel Grenville mine that was the reason for the settlement of Troon arising. Before that time, when Wheel Grenville started in about 1845, there was no village of Troon. There were a number of medieval hamlets scattered around, but once those great riches were discovered beneath the ground, first in the form of copper and later in the form of tin, miners were drawn from other parts of the county and the settlement of Troon was founded. Whenever a new community is founded, it comes with its own special problems, and Troon was no exception to that. As it wasn't an established community and people were coming from other districts who didn't know each other, they had to bond together and form their own friendship groups, their own social patterns here in this new community all afresh. And they certainly did that, and it became a very, very special place where everyone relied on everyone else, people helped each other. There were enough shops and local industries to support the community. They didn't need to go outside for anything. And it would have been a far different village from the one you see today. I started off by talking about these massive steam engines that were essential to the working of Wheel Grenville mine, where most of the people went every day. Those steam engines and the working of the mine itself created vast amounts of pollution. If you can imagine black coal smoke coming out from every one of those mine chimneys, of which there would have been dozens, if you can imagine the dust and the red slime created by the processing of the tin ore, all that getting up into the atmosphere and coming into the village of Troon. I often think perhaps on a Monday when people put their washing out, it would have been quite a defeating process, because all that smoke and all that dust would have made it not a pleasant sight. But nevertheless, it was a working community, and people knew that they had to put up with that or they would have no income and no future. Before 1845, when the Great Wheel Grenville mine opened, firstly as a copper mine, this was largely an upland area, granite moorlands, perhaps some little small farms and so on, but really of no great consequence. The only settlements were those little medieval hamlets that had been here for many generations, and it was not an important place. In fact, people down in Camborne would have probably thought that there were wild people living up on the moors above the town in those days, and they wouldn't have come up here. And that, of course, all changed in 1845 with the opening of the Great Wheel Grenville mine. There would have been a few smaller mining ventures in the area before that, but they were of no great consequence, and it wasn't until that discovery of riches below the ground in Wheel Grenville that the whole community came alive and started to grow. And one of the main reasons for that, although the mine opened in 1845 as a copper mine, one of the main reasons for its growth and development was the discovery in the late 1800s of one of the richest bodies of tin ore that has ever been discovered in Cornwall, the Great Flat Lode. It actually starts on the road that runs, or underneath the road that runs between Beacon and Troon, and then goes underground from here right across to Wheel Buller at Redruth. And that vast area of mines from here to Redruth got all their riches from that one great ore body, the Great Flat Lode. People came from all over Cornwall to this new mining field here in Troon. You may not think that Cornwall's a very big place, but of course in those days distances were rather different, because you couldn't travel by car, you had to go by foot or by horse and carriage or whatever. So if you came, for example, from St Just, as my family did, to settle here in Troon and work in the mines, or maybe you come from as far afield as Gunners Lake or somewhere like that, it would be really quite a journey to come from. So people came from all over Cornwall, from different mining fields, and I'm certain that from some of the names of people that you find in the community, they came from further afield than that as well, maybe from even as far afield as England, but we're not too sure about that. All that's left in the mining fields of Cornwall now are roofless buildings and chimneys pointing to the sky, but it wasn't always like that. And wherever you see these iconic buildings in Cornwall, you'll immediately know that you're in one of the mining areas. And nowhere was that more true than here in Troon. And I'm talking to you right now from the winding engine of the South Condero mine, which was once a separate mine in its own right, but eventually became part of that great mine which was the reason for the existence of the settlement of Troon, the Great Wheel Grenville mine. And all over the area here you will find reminders of that mining past, particularly in the form of these engine houses. They had two purposes. One was to wind up the ore from underground, such as this one that I'm sitting on now, but the main reason was to pump from underground the vast quantities of water that were found there, and which, if it was not removed, would make it impossible to mine anything. And it's quite interesting really to think of the capacity of some of these great pumping engines. There's one just in front of me here, which was called Marshall's pumping engine, and it's quite typical of those on Wheel Grenville. Marshall's engine and some of those further down would at peak times pump out of the mine. Each engine would pump 1,000 gallons of water a minute, which is quite a considerable quantity, and you can understand why that needed to be taken out from underground in order to let the miners go down and do their work. Of course, those miners had to have somewhere to live, and the community or settlement of Troon was founded just for that reason, so that the miners could have somewhere to live with their families and then go and work in the mine every day. The houses in the village are typical of those in a mining community. The long flat terraces which were put up as functional buildings just to house workers, and buildings which, although they're quite modern now inside, would have been very, very basic indeed when they were built by the mine owners to house the workers. Troon in the early days, and indeed right up to post Second World War, had no drainage and it had no mains water supply. People either had to go to the adit in Troon, which was again another ancient mine working, and to take water from there for their domestic use, or indeed to dip it out of the leat which runs along in front of the great terrace of houses in Pendarves Street. And you can still see there in the leat in Pendarves Street the little depressions made out of stone where you could dip your bucket in and take out a bucket of water to go indoors. Water was clearly very precious, and I suspect that people weren't as zealous in bathing and showering as we are today. Of course, living near a big mine, and Wheel Grenville was one of the biggest in the county, came with its own costs. Because if you think again of those many steam engines that were working and the amount of coal that they consumed 24 hours a day, there would be vast amounts of polluted smoke coming out from the chimneys. And as Troon, as a community, is to the windward of most of those chimneys, that smoke would have found its way into the village. And that wouldn't have been all, because the process of getting the tin from the tin ore was one which was relatively simple, because tin is quite heavy. So they would use much of the water that was pumped from underground by these great steam engines to operate that process. They would crush the tin ore up, and they would then run it across a surface with water. The waste would be washed off and the heavier tin ore would remain there. However, mixed in with the tin there would have been some impurities. There was certainly something known as arsenic, which was an impurity in the tin, but also there were iron impurities in the tin ore, and that would produce a vivid red staining to the water that was being washed off and discharged into the local streams. That in itself gave rise, of course, to the name we give to the river that rises here in Troon and runs down to the sea at Gwythian, the Red River, and that redness is just the iron staining in the water. But it also produced a red slime which would have been evident all around the mine. It would have been evident on the roads around the mine. It would have been evident on the clothing of the miners. And you can imagine that when we had a hot day and that red slime turned to dust and the wind rose, that would be carried into the village of Troon as well. So that, combined with the dense black smoke from the chimneys of the engine houses, would have caused quite a pollution problem in the village, though I doubt that people in those days would have seen it as such, because that was the way they lived, that was where they got their living, and it was something you just put up with. But I can imagine it would have caused all sorts of difficulties, perhaps on a Monday when ladies were putting their clothes out to dry and the wind was in the wrong direction, and all that dirt and pollution would have come into the village.